There is a particular kind of fraud built specifically for people who know about money. Not the clumsy kind, not the obvious kind, the kind that speaks your language, that uses your vocabulary, that gives you documents you know how to read, and statements that look exactly the way statements are supposed to look. Solomon Wright had spent 40 years in investment. He understood risk. He understood due diligence. He understood the difference between a real opportunity and a dressed-up lie, or so he believed. By the time he discovered that every pound he had placed with Leah Mercado, every bond, every property stake, every commodity position, existed only on paper she had printed herself, 365,000 pounds was gone, and the woman who had taken it had vanished as completely as the investments she had invented. This is what he remembered, and what he finally understood. The last statement she sent me arrived on a Tuesday morning in March. It was a clean, professional document, 12 pages, color-coded by asset class, with a summary page at the front showing my total portfolio value sitting at just over 388,000 pounds. There was a column for unrealized gains. There was a breakdown of fees, which were modest and clearly presented. There was a note at the bottom of page 1 that said the bond allocation had performed above benchmark for the third consecutive quarter, and that she was recommending a small rebalancing toward the commodity fund given current market conditions. I read it at the kitchen table with my coffee. It looked right. It looked exactly the way a portfolio statement is supposed to look. I had been receiving versions of this document for 4 years, and I had never once seen anything in it that gave me pause. I sent her a short email that afternoon. I said the statement looked good, and I agreed with the rebalancing suggestion. I told her to go ahead. She replied within the hour. She said she would process the rebalancing by end of week, and would confirm when complete. She said she hoped I was well. She said Manila had been very hot lately, and she was looking forward to a cooler month. That was the last message I ever received from Leah Mercado. My name is Solomon Wright. I am 72 years old, born in Lewisham, and I spent 40 years working in the investment sector, first as an analyst, then as a fund manager, and finally as a principal at a small boutique firm in the city that I helped found in 1998 and retired from in 2019. I know how money moves. I know how financial instruments are structured. I know what a bond prospectus looks like, and how commodity funds report their positions, and what real estate investment trusts disclose about their underlying assets. I have sat on the other side of the table from people trying to sell me things that did not hold up to scrutiny, and I have identified the problems. That has been, for most of my adult life, one of my primary professional functions. I tell you this not to establish my credentials, but because it is essential to understanding what happened. The fraud that was run on me was not designed to fool a layperson. It was designed to fool someone like me, and it succeeded for 4 years, which tells you more about the quality of the deception than anything else I could say about it. My wife Caroline died in 2017. We had been married for 38 years. She had a brain tumor that was diagnosed in October and had killed her by the following April. That is the quickest way to say it, and the only way I can say it at all, even now, because the extended version involves a kind of sustained emotional detail that I am not able to produce without losing the thread of what I am trying to tell you. What matters for this story is that when I retired in 2019, I was 69 years old, financially secure, professionally respected, and profoundly alone, in a way that the busy decades of work had largely concealed from me. I had a flat in Islington, and a pension that was more than sufficient, and a social life that consisted primarily of former colleagues and a small number of friends who were all, like me, at the stage of life where time had started to feel differently weighted than it once had. My daughter Claire lives in Edinburgh with her husband and 2 young children. We are close. I see her 4 or 5 times a year, and we speak most weeks. My son Michael is in Toronto, and we are less close, for reasons that have nothing to do with this story, and everything to do with the specific emotional distance that grows between fathers and sons when neither of them is very good at closing it. I began traveling seriously after I retired, which is not unusual for men in my position, and which I had been intending to do with Caroline before the diagnosis made it impossible. I went to places I had always meant to see: Lisbon for 3 weeks, Cape Town for a month, Japan twice. And then, in the autumn of 2020, the Philippines, initially for 6 weeks, because a former colleague named Jeffrey Marsh had told me that Cebu was one of the most underrated places he had ever visited, and that the pace of life there had done something genuinely good for him after his own retirement. I trusted Jeffrey's taste. He was a man who did not recommend things casually. I spent the first 2 weeks in Cebu, and then moved to Manila for the remaining month, because I wanted to understand the capital. I am the kind of person who wants to understand places properly, which requires seeing the center as well as the pleasant edges. Manila was complicated and alive, and I found it more interesting than I had expected, in the way that complicated, alive things generally are. I met Leah Mercado at a rooftop gathering, organized by a group of expats and local professionals that Jeffrey had connected me with before I arrived. She was 36 years old, dressed simply and well, and she was introduced to me by the man hosting the event as a financial broker who specialized in working with foreign investors navigating the Philippine market. I noted that she was the only person at the gathering whose professional description was directly relevant to mine, and I think that is the first thing that made me pay attention to her. Not her appearance, not her manner, the relevance. She was someone I could talk to about something I actually knew. She was sharp. That is the word I would have used then, and it remains accurate. Not aggressive sharp, not showy sharp. The particular sharpness of someone who has done their preparation and is comfortable with what they know. She had read the market carefully. She understood macroeconomic conditions in Southeast Asia with a fluency that suggested genuine engagement rather than surface-level familiarity. She asked me about my background, and when I explained it, she asked follow-up questions that only made sense if she had absorbed the first answers properly. We talked for 2 hours at that gathering, mostly about markets, occasionally about other things. She told me she had been brokering for 8 years, that she had built a small client base of primarily foreign investors who found the local market confusing to navigate independently, and that her approach was conservative. She said she was not interested in chasing returns. She was interested in protecting capital and generating reliable income over medium and long time frames. She said this was an unfashionable approach in a market that attracted a lot of speculative money, but that her clients stayed with her because the results were consistent. I said I appreciated conservative approaches. I said I had spent 4 decades watching spectacular returns turn into spectacular losses because the people chasing them had not understood what they were actually holding. She smiled at that. She said, "That is exactly the problem. Most people do not read what they are signing." I said that was true. She said, "I make my clients read everything, every document, every disclosure. I insist on it. Some of them find it tedious. I do not apologize for it." That was the thing that locked in my trust. Not charm, not warmth. The insistence on documentation. For a man of my background, a broker who insists that clients read every piece of paper is a broker who is not hiding anything in the paper. That was my logic. It was impeccably sound logic, applied to false premises, which is the most reliable way to reach the wrong conclusion. We had coffee separately 3 days later, then dinner. Then I extended my Manila stay by 2 weeks, and we met several more times, in contexts that were half professional and half personal, the line between them blurring in the way that it does when 2 people who have professional chemistry discover they also have personal chemistry. She was not trying to seduce me, or if she was, it was done with sufficient subtlety that I experienced it as simply the natural development of a connection between 2 people who found each other interesting. I am 72 now. I was 69 then. I am not foolish enough to think that a 36-year-old woman finds a 69-year-old man irresistible for his looks. But people connect across ages for reasons that are not always simple, and what I felt with Leah was something I had not felt since Caroline died. The sensation of being engaged by another person, of conversation that moved and challenged and arrived somewhere neither of you had planned to go. When I flew back to London in December, I had agreed to place an initial allocation with her brokerage. £40,000, spread across what she described as a short-duration bond position in a Philippine infrastructure fund, and a small stake in a commercial property trust she managed on behalf of a group of local and foreign investors. She sent me the documentation before I left. I read it, all of it. I asked questions. She answered them. The documents were detailed and looked right, in all the ways I knew to look for. I signed the allocation forms and she confirmed receipt. The first quarterly statement arrived in March 2021. It was everything I have described. Professional, detailed, specific in the right ways. The bond position had performed at 4.2% annualized, which was exactly what she had projected. The property trust had returned 3.8%, slightly below her projection, which she noted in a covering email, and explained by reference to a specific planning delay on one of the underlying assets. She gave me the name of the asset. She gave me the address. She told me it was a minor delay and that she expected the position to recover in the following quarter. I want you to understand what that explanation did. A broker who explains underperformance is a broker who is not hiding underperformance. A broker who gives you the name and address of the underlying asset when something goes slightly wrong is a broker who is confident you can verify what she is telling you. My entire professional life had trained me to read those signals in exactly that way, and they were being produced deliberately, precisely because someone had understood how I would read them. I flew back to Manila in April 2021 for 3 weeks. Leah and I had dinner on the second evening. The dynamic between us had continued in the months between. Regular calls, occasional messages, the particular warmth of a connection that has established itself between two people without having been formally defined. I was aware that I was attached to her in a way that extended beyond professional respect. I was also aware that this attachment was something I needed to be careful about because it was the kind of thing that had the potential to cloud judgment, and clear judgment was something I valued above most other things. I told myself I was being careful because the investments were structured conventionally and the documentation was thorough and the returns were consistent with projections. I told myself the professional relationship was clean and the personal connection was something separate, and the two were not interfering with each other. That was the most expensive thing I ever told myself. Over the next year, I increased my allocation 3 times. Each increase followed a strong quarterly statement and a call with Leah in which she walked me through the positions in detail. Each time she recommended rather than pushed, she presented options and their respective risk profiles and left the decision explicitly with me. The increases were £60,000, then £75,000, then £85,000. By April 2022, I had £260,000 allocated across the 3 asset classes she managed: the bond fund, the property trust, and a commodity position she had introduced at the end of 2021 in a fund linked to agricultural exports. The agricultural fund had been the most interesting of the 3 from a structural standpoint. She had explained it with a level of technical specificity that I found genuinely impressive. The mechanics of how it was linked to export prices, the hedging strategy that protected against currency fluctuation, the way the income was distributed quarterly. I asked to see the fund's own documentation, separate from her statements. She sent it. A 30-page prospectus with full regulatory disclosures and a list of the fund's institutional investors that included several names I recognized. I read all 30 pages. I could not find a fault. There was a night in Manila, in June 2022, that I think about more than I think about any other moment in the 4 years. We were at dinner at a place in Poblacion that she liked. Small, not particularly expensive, the kind of place you go to when you want to eat rather than to be seen eating. She had a glass of red wine, and I had the same, and we were talking about something that had nothing to do with money or investments. I cannot remember exactly what. Something about the difference between how people in London and people in Manila use public space. Something that made us both think, and then disagree slightly, and then arrive somewhere more interesting than either of our starting positions. I looked at her across the table and I thought, this is what I missed, not just since Caroline died, longer than that. This quality of exchange, 2 minds working on the same material, and producing something neither of them had separately. I had had it with Caroline, and I had had versions of it with colleagues across my career, and I had not had it at all in the years of grief and retirement. And here it was, in a restaurant in Manila, with a woman 33 years younger than me who had my money and whom I trusted completely. I did not say any of that out loud, but I felt it, and the feeling of it made me less careful than I was when I did not feel it. I placed the final allocation in January 2023, £105,000, split between an increased position in the bond fund and a new tranche in the property trust. She had presented it as a rebalancing opportunity. The bond fund had performed strongly, and she wanted to lock in some of that performance by reinvesting into the property position, which she said was about to benefit from a planning approval she had been tracking for several months. She was specific about the planning approval. She gave me the name of the local authority committee, the date of the expected decision, the projected impact on the asset's valuation. I checked the committee name. It existed. I found references to it online. I could not find the specific agenda item she had described, but that was not unusual. Local planning records in the Philippines were not always comprehensively published in English. I told myself that. I filed the gap in my verification as a limitation of publicly available information rather than a limitation in what she was telling me. That distinction, in retrospect, was where the last of my judgment failed. By March 2023, I had placed a total of £365,000 with Leah Mercado across 4 allocation decisions made over 2.5 years. My portfolio statement at that point showed a value of just over £388,000. Unrealized gains of approximately £23,000 above my invested capital, consistent with the projected returns across all 3 asset classes. The document was immaculate. The numbers made sense. The performance was plausible. I had reviewed it with the same rigor I would have applied to any client report that crossed my desk in 40 years of professional life, and I had found nothing wrong. I sent her the email agreeing to the rebalancing. She replied. That was the last I heard from her. In the first week I assumed a technical issue. Email can fail. People get ill. She had mentioned, on a call 2 weeks earlier, that she had been dealing with some family matter that was taking up time, which I had registered and not pressed because it was not my business. I sent a follow-up email. I tried calling. The number rang and was not answered. I sent a WhatsApp message. It delivered, but was not read. By the second week I was doing what I do when something does not add up. I was going back to the documents. I started with the bond fund. I had the full prospectus and the regulatory disclosure. I found the registered entity name and searched for it in the appropriate Philippine regulatory database, the Securities and Exchange Commission. The entity was not registered. I tried variant spellings of the name. I tried related entity names listed in the document. Nothing matched anything in the official register. I moved to the property trust. I had an address for the primary underlying asset, a commercial development in a district of Manila I knew. I looked it up using satellite imagery. The building existed. I found public records about it. I found no reference anywhere to the trust structure she had described or to the investor group she had said owned it. I tried the Agricultural Commodity Fund. The prospectus listed 3 institutional investors by name, firms I had recognized when I first read the document and whose presence had contributed to my confidence. I contacted 2 of them through their public channels and asked whether they had any association with the fund as described. One did not respond. The other responded within 2 days to say that they had no record of the fund or the vehicle described, and that they were concerned about the use of their name in any document, and asked me to share the prospectus so they could investigate further. I sat with that email for a long time. The process of understanding what I had uncovered took several days, not because the evidence was complicated once I was looking for it, but because each piece required a specific response, a kind of methodical dismantling of something I had built carefully over 2.5 years, each document re-examined with the opposite assumption to the one I had used when I first read it. Instead of looking for what was right, I was looking for what was wrong. And when you look for what is wrong, with eyes that know what they are looking for, you find it quickly. The bond fund was a fabrication. The registration number in the prospectus was formatted correctly, but corresponded to a dissolved entity with a completely different name. The property trust had no legal existence. The commercial building was real, but the investment structure around it was invented. The agricultural fund's prospectus had been constructed using real institutional names attached to a fictional vehicle, which was a more sophisticated fraud than the first two. It required knowing which names would be credible to someone like me, and choosing them deliberately. The quarterly statements, 12 of them across 4 years, had been produced internally. The returns figures, the performance commentary, the fee disclosures, all of it had been created by someone who understood what a genuine institutional investor expected to see, and had reproduced it precisely enough to pass scrutiny. The planning approval I had tried to verify. The regulatory committee I had found references to. All of it had been real enough at the edges to look real at the center, and the center was empty. 4 years. £365,000. Constructed performance totaling just over £23,000 in fictional gains. Every document I had received since my first allocation had been printed by someone who knew me well enough to know exactly what would satisfy my professional eye. I called Jeffrey first, not because he was the most practically useful person to call, but because he was the person who had sent me to Manila in the first place, and I think I needed him to know what had happened before I was able to do anything else. He was silent for a long time after I explained. Then he said, "God, Saul, I'm so sorry." He did not say anything more complicated than that, and I was grateful for the simplicity of it. I called Claire that evening. She was calm in the way she becomes calm when something is serious, a quieting of her usual energy, a focus that I recognized from her childhood. She asked the right questions, and she did not say anything accusatory. She said she was coming to London the following weekend. I said she did not need to. She said she was aware of that. I filed a report with the City of London Police Economic Crime Unit, which handles this category of fraud for UK victims, regardless of where it occurs. The officer who took my initial statement was thorough and did not make me feel foolish, which I appreciated more than I could say at the time. I also filed with the Philippine authorities, through a lawyer I found in Manila, on the recommendation of the British Embassy's consular team. Both investigations are ongoing. I have been told, by both the police and the lawyer, that cross-border fraud recovery is difficult and slow, and that I should not expect either a quick resolution or full recovery. I have accepted this. I was in the investment sector for 40 years. I understand what the realistic outcomes look like. Leah Mercado's phone number was disconnected within 3 weeks of her last email. Her professional website, which I had visited many times over 4 years, went offline around the same time. The email address became undeliverable. The brokerage name she had used, which I had never been able to find in any official registry, but had attributed to the particular opacity of Philippine financial regulation for smaller operators, was confirmed by my Manila lawyer to have no legal existence. She had practiced under a name that was not registered, operated without a license, and placed no money into any instrument that existed outside the documents she produced. I want to be clear about the specific mechanism of this, because I think it is the part of the story that carries the most useful warning. What she built was not a fake investment operation with fake offices and fake staff. It was simpler than that. It was a one-person document production. She needed a printer, knowledge of how regulatory filings are formatted, knowledge of how institutional documentation is structured, and knowledge of which names and terminology would be credible to a specific kind of investor. She had all of those things. She may have had assistance. The quality of some of the documentation suggests more than a single person's resources, but the operation at its core was lean. The overhead was low. The profit was everything I gave her. What she invested in me, to make it work, was time and research. She knew my background before we met. The gathering where Jeffrey's contact introduced me as a retired city investor. She was there because someone like me was expected to be there. The 2 hours of conversation about markets that felt like a genuine meeting of minds was, in part, genuine, because she had genuinely prepared for it. She knew enough to engage me. She knew exactly which signals of professional rigor, the insistence on documentation, the explanation of underperformance, the named assets, the committee references, would satisfy the specific skepticism of someone with my history. That is what I mean when I say it was built for someone like me. A less financially literate person might have been satisfied with simpler fabrications. I required better ones. She provided them. For 4 years, every time I looked at what she gave me, I found what I was looking for. Not because I was credulous, because she had anticipated what I would look for and put it there. The personal dimension is the part I find hardest to address directly, because it involves admitting something about myself that a man of my background and temperament does not find easy to admit. I was not just her investor. I was I am not sure what the right word is, not a romantic partner in any conventional sense, something more ambiguous. Someone she had made feel understood, someone who had dinner with her in a restaurant in Poblacion, and looked across the table and felt what I felt, and filed it as separate from the professional relationship, when in fact it was the engine of the professional relationship. The personal attachment was not the byproduct of the fraud. The personal attachment was the fraud's primary structural support. Because as long as I felt connected to her as a person, I was not going to interrogate her work as a broker. I had told myself I was maintaining the separation between the personal and professional. What I had actually done was allow the personal to protect the professional from scrutiny, and she had counted on exactly that. The warmth, the intelligence, the 2 hours of conversation at a rooftop gathering in Manila, all of it had a function, making me trust her enough not to verify the things that could have been verified. After Caroline died, I had been careful, in the years of grief and adjustment, not to let the loneliness show. I managed it the way I managed most things, structurally, with enough activity and enough professional engagement that it remained in the background. When I retired, the structure fell away and the loneliness became more present. I did not say this to anyone. I barely said it to myself. But it was there, and when I went to Manila and met a woman who engaged me the way Leah engaged me, something shifted, something opened, and the opening, which felt like the best thing to have happened to me in several years, was the vulnerability the fraud required. I have thought many times about whether any of it was real for her. The dinner conversations, the moment she laughed at something I said in a way that seemed unguarded, the call where she mentioned the family matter and seemed briefly less composed than usual. I have thought about it and reached the same conclusion I always reach, with questions that cannot be resolved. I do not know. I cannot know. And spending energy on the question does not serve me. What I know is that the professional relationship was entirely fabricated, and that the professional relationship was the primary relationship. Everything else existed in its service. That is a sufficient answer, even if it is not a complete one. Claire came to London that weekend, as she said she would. She did not ask how it had happened in a way that required me to defend myself. She asked what I needed, and what the next practical steps were, and whether I was sleeping, which was the right question, because I was not sleeping particularly well. She stayed for 4 days. When she left, she said, "You would have caught it, Dad, in a normal situation. This was designed so you wouldn't." I said I knew that. She said she meant it as something that was actually true, not just something kind to say. I said I knew that too. Michael called from Toronto. Our conversation was shorter, in the way our conversations generally are, but warmer than usual. He said he was sorry this had happened. He said he was glad I was all right. I said I was all right. There was a pause, and then he said, "I've been meaning to call more." I said, "So have I." We left it at that, which is more than we usually leave it. The financial adjustment required by a loss of £365,000 is significant but manageable in my specific situation. My pension is intact and is sufficient for a comfortable life. The investments represented capital I had intended as cushion and legacy rather than income, and their absence changes the shape of my later years without altering their foundation. I am telling you this not to make the loss seem smaller. It is not small. But because I think it is important to say that 69 to 72 are years in which a man should not be doing this kind of calculation for the first time. The loss is financial, but it is also temporal. I spent 4 years in what I believed was a productive financial relationship, I spent 40 years developing the expertise that was used to fool me. Those years do not come back. What I carry forward is something specific. Not caution exactly, because I was cautious. Not skepticism exactly, because I was skeptical. What I did not have, and what I should have had, is the discipline to apply my professional rigor to the things I most wanted to be true. I verified the things that could have been wrong. I did not verify the things I had already decided were right. The bond fund documentation looked right to me because I had decided, before I examined it, that Leah Mercado was a trustworthy person. And once I had made that decision, the examination became a confirmation exercise rather than a scrutiny exercise. Confirmation and scrutiny look the same from the outside. From the inside, they point in opposite directions. There is a man in my former firm, I will call him William, because he does not need to be named, who has called me several times since this became known among people I used to work with. He called once to commiserate and twice to ask if he could write about it, anonymized, for a publication aimed at high net worth individuals. He believes, and I agree with him, that this category of fraud, sophisticated, targeted, designed specifically for people with financial expertise, is significantly underreported because the people it happens to are ashamed to report it. They believe, as I initially believed, that it says something damaging about their competence. I have given William my consent to write what he wants to write. I am also saying this here, as plainly as I know how to say it, because the shame is less useful than the information. It happened to me. I have 40 years of professional investment experience, and it happened to me because the deception was built for someone with exactly that background, and because I had a personal attachment that I allowed to function as a substitute for the last layer of due diligence. If it can happen to me, it can happen to anyone. And if you are a person with financial expertise who is also, in some quiet part of yourself, lonely, you are not less vulnerable than the lay person next to you. You may be more so. Because the con artist who wants your money will learn your language before they speak to you, and they will use your competence against you by giving you just enough to satisfy it. Verify independently, not just through the documents provided, through sources that have no reason to confirm what you are being told, regulatory databases, direct contact with named institutional investors, physical verification of named assets through means not suggested by the person who named them. The extra step that feels unnecessary when everything already looks right is the only step that would have caught this. I did not take it. I now know exactly why I did not take it, and the knowing is the thing I have left. I am still in the Islington flat. I still travel when the mood is right. I have been to Lisbon twice more since all of this, because Lisbon was the first place I went after I retired, and it does something good for me that I have not been able to replicate anywhere else. I have not been back to Manila. I do not rule it out. The Philippines is not the problem. A person used the Philippines as a location the way she used bond documentation as a format, as a context that felt legitimate, that gave what she was doing the texture of reality. The country is not responsible for that. I think about Leah Mercado less than I expected to. Not because the money doesn't matter, because I have understood, as clearly as I am capable of understanding anything, what she was and what she was not, and that understanding, however painful it is to hold, has a kind of completeness to it that the wondering would not. She was a skilled practitioner of a specific fraud. She chose me because I was the right profile. She built the right tools for the right target, and she deployed them for 4 years and then she left. That is what happened. The dinner conversations were part of it. The warmth was part of it. The 2 hours talking about markets at a rooftop gathering in Manila was the beginning of it. There is nothing in that picture that requires me to feel foolish. Deceived, yes. Diminished, no. I am a 72-year-old man who lost a significant amount of money to a well-constructed fraud that was designed, specifically and deliberately, to defeat the defenses I had. That is not a story about my incompetence. It is a story about someone else's capability, and the particular vulnerability that comes from being human and wanting connection in the years when connection has become harder to find. I found it, briefly, in the wrong place. That is the whole of it. Jeffrey called last month. He was visiting London from Manila, and we had dinner in a place near my flat. The kind of dinner two old colleagues have, when enough time has passed, that the hard thing can be talked about without it swallowing the evening. He asked how I was doing. I said better than I had expected. He said he had always felt partly responsible for pointing me toward Manila in the first place. I told him that was not a reasonable position, and that I meant it. He said he was glad I was out the other side of it. I said I was too. The flat is quiet in the evenings, which is a fact rather than a complaint. Claire calls on Sundays. Michael calls more often than he used to, which is a change I did not expect and have not questioned. William published his piece and sent me a copy. Several people wrote to him after it ran. Men like me, he said, who had experienced similar things and had not said so publicly. He said he thought my story, in its anonymized form, had given them permission to acknowledge theirs. That is not a bad thing to have done with it. That is, in fact, the best use I can imagine for something that has no other redemptive quality. The money is gone. The 4 years are gone. The woman who took them is somewhere I cannot reach, and the investigations are moving at the pace investigations move. What remains is the understanding, and the decision to say it plainly, to whoever needs to hear it, so that the price I paid has at least the value of a warning. That is what I have. It will have to be enough, and mostly on the better days, it is.